Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now I'm found. Was blind, but now I see. 'Twas grace that taught my heart to fear, and grace my fears to flee. How precious did that grace appear the hour I first believed. Through many dangers, toils, and snares, and already from His grace hath brought me safe thus far, and grace will lead me home. When we've been there 10,000 years, as shining as the sun, we know there's days to see God's face, and when we first begun. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now I'm found. Was blind, but now I see.
This morning we are continuing in Mark's Gospel, the 9th chapter, beginning with verse 38 through 41. John said to him, "Teacher, we saw someone casting out demons in your name, and we tried to stop him because he was not following us." But Jesus said, "Do not stop him, for no one who does a deed of power in my name will be able soon afterward to speak evil of me. Whoever is not against us is for us. For truly I tell you, whoever gives you a cup of water to drink because you bear the name of Christ will by no means lose their reward." This is the word of God for the people of God. Praise be to God. So, 5 weeks. You know what I'm talking about? 5 weeks, 5 more weeks, and it will all be over. At least until the next election. 5 more weeks, and I can once again watch television without being bombarded by the hateful, fact-deficient, 30-second character assassinations that have become part and parcel of our political process. 5 more weeks, and it's all over. Oh, really? Or is this perhaps just the way we do politics? Is this just the way we do politics in 21st century America? Or Is the way we do politics simply a symptom of a much deeper problem? Is it just politics that are this way? Or is there something much more basic at play in our society? I have to tell you, I think it's the latter. It seems to me that as a society, we have become very adept at mistrusting at best and demonizing at worst anyone who looks, talks, acts, or believes differently than we do. And that's on both sides of the aisle, folks. That's liberals and conservatives, Republicans and Democrats. As a society, we have become really good at demonizing people who are different than us. I think we live in an increasingly anxious and fearful world. And one of the things we seem to fear most in life are people who are not just like us. As author and pastor Dr. Robert Meyer said in the conference I attended earlier this weekend, as human beings, our default setting is that different is somehow deficient. Our default setting is that different is deficient instead of different just being what? Different. Right. When we encounter someone who looks, talks, acts, believes differently than us, our tendency is to discount, to see them as less than, rather than as simply different. For some reason, different is threatening to us. But apparently, this is not just a characteristic of 21st century America, is it? For according to the passage I read from Mark, the disciples themselves struggled with much the same issue. In writing about this particular text, Professor David Lowe says that one of the things this complex passage reveals is our human tendency to fear those who are different. And for this reason, to insist on a level of conformity or uniformity or even bureaucracy to manage the anxiety that comes from our fear of the different. In this story, Jesus was upset that someone else, meaning not one of them, was casting out demons in Jesus' name. And they wanted Jesus to make them stop. But Jesus will have none of that. Instead, he tells them not to worry about it. Not to get all wrapped around the axle that someone else is doing good in his name. For in fact, anyone who does good in Jesus' name, he says, will have a hard time doing harm in his name in the future. In other words, if they are not against us, then they are for us. So quit worrying, he tells his disciples. Quit worrying about who's in and who's out. And just celebrate the good they are doing. Now, I imagine that's not exactly the response Jesus' disciples were hoping to hear. Because I think, like us, they seem to have this need to draw lines, to clearly delineate who's in and who's out. We do it all the time, don't we? Sometimes we do it by gender. You know there are still denominations in our country, in the Christian church, who will not ordain women. Sometimes we do it by age. They're too young. They're too old. Our sexual orientation. We do it by ethnicity or immigration status. We do it by income level or how many taxes they pay or don't pay. And sometimes, and I think this is the most heartbreaking of all, sometimes Americans, we do it by religion. Truth be told, we often do it by religion. So the question for us then, I think, is what, if anything, does this particular passage from Mark say to us as followers of Christ about how we view, how we think about, how we treat persons who name God differently than we do? Or perhaps we choose not to name God at all. And I think this is important. I think it's particularly important in light of the furor that's been caused in recent weeks. First, by that offensive video made by the Coptic Orthodox Christian in California to belittle the Muslim faith in all the hell it's caused around the world. And I think it's important because of the anti-Muslim ads placed in New York City subways last week. Ones that said, in any war between the civilized man and the savage, support the civilized man. Support Israel. Defeat jihad. I have a problem with that kind of labeling, that kind of dismissing, belittling of a whole group of people, even if there are those on the extreme that perhaps bring that about in some way. I have trouble that we just write off or characterize or character assassinate a whole group of people because they think or believe or differently than we do. Now, this is a kind of an aside. You know, the argument I've heard over the last couple of weeks in regards to this film and all that it's caused, or even the ads in the New York City subway system, is that that's a part of freedom of speech. And so, yes, they have a right to make those films or to place those ads. And you're right. As Americans whose free speech is protected by the Constitution, that man who made that film, the woman who placed those ads, yes, they had the right to do it. But I guess the question for me is what they did right. And there's a difference. Was what they did necessary? Did it bring about any good for anyone? Were they helpful in any way? Were they even moral? Did they do anything to further the cause of Christ in our world? Do you think anybody's converted to Christianity, to the way of love and Christ because of that film? Or those ads? So yeah, they had the right to do what they did, but was it right? In today's passage from Mark, the unnamed exorcist is performing acts in Jesus' name. We don't know, because Mark doesn't tell us, whether that makes that man a follower of Jesus, whether he was a would-be devotee, or just someone who's heard that Jesus' name works like a charm. Mark doesn't tell us any of that, does he? What we do know is that what he's doing seems to make Jesus' disciples nervous. So nervous, in fact, that they try to stop him. But they can't. We also know that after apparently giving his blessing to this unnamed character, Jesus then does what Jesus does best. He turns the tables and ends up lecturing his own disciples against the peril of placing stumbling blocks in front of others. I should have read one verse further, and you would have seen that. All of this, though, makes me wonder, is our zeal for the gospel, or perhaps more honestly, our fear of those who are different from us, placing a stumbling block before persons of other faiths that make it harder to see and to feel the love of God in Christ? And if it is, what should our response be to those who believe in a faith that is different from our own, or even those who have no faith at all? Brian McLaren is one of my favorite contemporary commentators on the church and on Christianity as a whole. And in his video, Towards the Other, Brian offers these thoughts. Would you get the lights?
When the subject of interreligious friendship and collaboration comes up, people almost always say, well, we've got these big differences. And then other people respond by saying, oh no, all religions are the same. I think the truth is, we are very, very different. Our biggest problem, though, isn't our differences. Our biggest problem is that we build identity, whatever our religion, we build identity by enforcing hostility toward the other. In other words, I learn who I am by learning who I'm against. I learn who I am by learning who's against me. And so when your identity is oppositional, when your identity is based in your fear of the other, then it doesn't matter whether you put a label of Christian, Muslim, Buddhist on that, you have an inherently hostile identity. My question is, can we find a way of holding Christian identity that sends us toward the other with love and hospitality rather than with fear and hostility?
It's a great question. Can we find a way to be authentically Christian, to hold our Christian identity that actually sends us, moves us toward the other, rather than moving us away in fear and hostility? I think we can. We don't have to define ourselves as Christian over and against anyone else. We are Christian because we are followers of the Christ, followers of the way of love Jesus taught, lived, modeled, died for. 3 weeks ago, on the anniversary of September the 11th, Brian McLaren wrote these words: "To love your neighbor of another faith means to seek to understand her, to learn to see the world from her perspective, to stand with her, as it were, so that you can feel what she feels and maybe even come to understand why she loves what she loves." And I agree wholeheartedly with what Brian says. And I think we can make a case based on what Jesus actually did in his life. Here in this passage we read today and throughout the Gospels, that Jesus could agree with that too. Yet, we are still a people who love to draw lines, who love to label. Are we not? And I have to tell you, I'm as guilty as the next person. One of the things Robin Meyer said at this conference this past weekend, that, oftentimes we tend to see people on the far right as the one who draw lines and who throw out labels and say hurtful and ugly things. But one of the things he said, and I know this to be true, and I know that it has been true in my life as well, is that people on the left can be just as guilty of drawing lines and placing labels and saying hurtful things that leave others out, particularly in regards to those on the right. That's something that I struggle with. I like to consider myself progressive, broad-minded, open-minded, accepting of the other. But folks, I have to tell you, I have a hard time sometimes accepting those on the far right whose intolerance I find intolerable. And I think we laugh because we all have that. A lot of you feel that same way, don't you? But when we're intolerant of their right to be who they are, we're really not being any different than them, are we? Our response instead of labeling or setting them aside or casting them off or discounting them for who they are, would be to somehow find a way to love them and work with them in the name of Christ. And that's, I don't know, for me, that's easier said than done. I'm better. Over the years, and maybe it's just a part of maturity, of growing in grace, I'm getting better about that each year. But I've still got a long way to go. But one of the things that I like to remember when I'm tempted to write off those who disagree with me, even if they think I'm wrong, is that every time you draw a line between who's in and who's out, whether you're drawing it from the far right or the far left or anywhere in between, every time you draw a line between who's in and who's out, you'll find Jesus on the other side of that line. The reality is that we live in an increasingly diverse and complex world. When I was growing up, it was rare to know someone of a different faith. That's not true for our kids, is it? We work with, we go to school with, we live next door to people who are Muslim, and Jew, and Buddhist, and Sikh, and Hindu, who are atheists or agnostic. Fill in the blank. We know people in those other faiths. That's just part of living in a pluralistic world. So I think perhaps this week's reading from Mark provides a good opportunity for us as Christians to reflect on our responsibility to move toward those who believe differently than we do. Robert Myers, the man I went to hear this weekend, suggested that the future of the church may well depend on how well we do this. That the future of the church is not dependent so much on what we believe, but on how we learn to live out the radical love we see in Jesus. Now, to be fair, when you take the passage of Scripture, there's often various ways of interpreting that. And if you look at this passage from Mark in its original context, the passage most likely was addressing the early inter-Christian disputes, and not so much disputes for the faith. And as Robert Meyer pointed out in the seminar I attended, the early Christian community, much unlike what we tend to think, was not all of one mind. The early Christian community was very diverse in their beliefs about who Jesus was. Did you know that there are 5 different theories of the atonement in the New Testament alone? There are multiple understandings of when Jesus became the Son of God, all the way from the birth to the resurrection and at different points in between. The early Christian community was not, as we sometimes suppose, of one mind on things of theology. They weren't even sure. They couldn't agree on what it meant for Jesus to be the Son of God, to be who he was, or what that meant. It wasn't until Constantine became emperor in the 3rd century Rome, and Constantine was converted to Christianity, and then Constantine tried to nail it all down with councils and creeds, and dismissing some who disagreed as heretics. So the reason I'm telling you all that is that we sometimes get this simplistic idea that all the early Christians thought alike, that they believed alike, that they thought the exact same things about Jesus. But folks, that's just not the way it was. It wasn't until the 3rd century that things began to start narrowing, and we began to focus on what we call orthodoxy, or right belief. Prior to Constantine, prior to the 3rd century, the focus in the early Christian communities was not on right belief, orthodoxy, but right practice, orthopraxy. The early Christians focused on living the way of Jesus and not on making everybody believe exactly as they believe about Jesus. Does that make sense? That's our hang-up, folks. That's not the hang-up of the early church. So I think the point Jesus was making in this passage is if they're doing good, if they're living out the law of love, my love, God's love, in what they're doing, then it doesn't matter that they're with us totally. That's not what counts. Leave them alone. Let them demonstrate and do good in the name of God. What's important is living the way of radical love and hospitality as demonstrated by Jesus, as lived out by Jesus. And then I guess the question for me is, shouldn't that be how it is today as well? As David Love says, 2,000 years later, after inquisitions, in pogroms, and the Holocaust, in Northern Ireland, and the Balkans, and 9/11, and religious outrage and violence of recent days, after all of this, can we not also imagine that Jesus calls us to be at peace with those who name God differently, or who are not able to name God at all? Can we not imagine that Jesus would have us not only tolerate those of other faith traditions, but to also seek out their welfare? Can we not imagine Jesus calling us to understand them, love them, and in all these ways be at peace with one another? I think that's who Jesus was and who Jesus is. I think that's who Jesus calls us to be. And again, this conference I went to this weekend, one of the things Dr. Meyer said was how we answer those questions and how we live that out, really, the future of the Christian church depends on that. And one of the things he said, young people, one of the problems they have with the church is our exclusive nature. And then one of the ways we can begin to reach, in his opinion, one of the ways we can begin to reach younger generations is by learning to build bridges across those things that make us different. Learning to work with persons not only of other denominations who are doing good, but also persons of other faiths. Muslims, Buddhists, Sikhs, Jews. As Brian McLaren called it, we have to learn to move toward the other. Respecting our differences and understanding that different is not deficient somehow, but that different really is just different. Our call to discipleship this morning is Jesus on the main line. If you're here and you wish to unite with this particular congregation of God's church by either profession of faith or transfer of membership, you're invited to come forward as we stand and sing together.